I will never forget the look of disdain on that young officer's face, a look that did not see a respected 68-year-old woman with almost half a century of service to justice. He only saw a threat, a black woman driving a car that, in his mind, could not be mine. It all started with a simple, "Stop here, ma'am," but it quickly turned into a humiliation so profound that for a moment, it made me doubt if the country I lived in still considered me human. I was driving my silver Cadillac Escalade, purchased with my own salary, the fruit of decades of tireless work as a federal judge in Atlanta, when the red and blue lights began flashing behind me. I was on Oak Ridge Avenue, a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where doctors, lawyers, and executives live. But for Officer Ryan Colby, that was suspicious territory for someone like me. I got out of the car with my hands visible, as I had taught thousands of citizens in my judicial decisions. Calm, respect, dignity, but he didn't want respect. He wanted power. "Is this car really yours?" he asked, with a sneering smile, as two other officers surrounded my vehicle. "Or are you just taking care of it for someone else?" I replied serenely. "Yes, officer, it's mine. I bought it outright 3 years ago." He laughed loudly, turning to his colleagues. "Of course it is. And I'm the governor of Georgia." One of them looked away, embarrassed, but no one dared to contradict him. Colby then demanded my documents. He leafed through my wallet as if it were fake, examined the car's registration with disdain, and, without any legal justification, ordered, "Hands on the hood. Let's see what you're hiding." I obeyed, but every second was a stab to the soul. As he searched my car without a warrant, he threw my folders on the ground, confidential documents from ongoing cases, letters from family members, even the framed portrait of my granddaughter. "Oh, look at this! She even bought a judge's badge!" he scoffed, holding my official ID badge as if it were a Halloween costume. "You think you can fool us with this, Grandma?" I tried to maintain my composure, but inside, my heart bled. Not from fear. I had faced armed defendants, gangs, corrupt politicians, but from the coldness with which he denied my existence, my history, my humanity. "Officer, this is my legitimate federal court badge," I said with a firm voice. "Of course it is," he replied, mimicking my voice with scorn. "Soon you'll be saying you dine with the president." He opened my purse and spilled everything onto the asphalt. My lipstick, my reading glasses, my health insurance card, even the wedding ring I never take off. "Got a lot of money here, huh? Where did it come from? Drug sales? Bank robbery?" he asked, holding my Department of Justice travel receipts. "Those are official expense reimbursements," I explained. "Oh, official," he repeated, as if it were a dirty joke. One of the older officers murmured, "Maybe we should check that, Colby." But the young man just snorted. "Check what? That she bought a uniform from a costume shop?" That's when I decided there was no point in arguing. The truth didn't matter to him. Only what he wanted to believe mattered. So, in silence, I observed everything. The patrol car number, 318 Delta. The names on the badges. The exact time, 1:47 p.m. I memorized every word, every gesture, every mocking laugh, because I knew that sooner or later he would have to account for it. I asked for my cell phone back. He handed it to me with a theatrical gesture, as if doing me a real favor. I called my assistant at the court, but I used the emergency code only she knew. "I need Ebony Protocol activated. I am being unlawfully detained on Oak Ridge. Officer Colby, plate 318 Delta. Clear violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments." She understood immediately. In less than 5 minutes, my phone vibrated with an encrypted message. "Support en route. Stay strong." Colby, of course, thought I was bluffing. Going to call the Justice League now, Auntie? But what he didn't know, and would only discover weeks later before a room full of reporters, lawyers, and federal authorities, was that, at that exact moment, the judicial protection system had already been activated. And when that happens, even the mayor answers the phone. For now, however, I was just another black woman being treated like a criminal. Handcuffs on my wrists. Public humiliation. Silence from those who could speak but chose to remain quiet. But I didn't break, because I knew that soon he would be before me. not as an executioner, but as a defendant, and I, not as a victim, but as a judge, but that he didn't know yet. The handcuffs cut into my wrists as if I were a dangerous criminal, not a respectful citizen being punished for daring to exist where someone like Officer Colby thought I shouldn't be. He pushed me into the back seat of the patrol car with unnecessary force, almost making me stumble. "Careful, Grandma. We don't want you breaking a hip before dinner," he said, chuckling softly to his colleagues. One of them, older, looked away but said not a word. No one did. Their silence was as violent as Colby's hands. During the drive to the station, he continued with his malicious comments, as if telling a joke to friends. "Think you're going to fool us with that toy badge? She even brought a fake medal. Must have bought everything at the downtown thrift store." One of the officers in the front seat murmured, "She really does look like a judge." Colby snorted. "Sure, and I'm a Supreme Court justice. Stop being soft, Harris. This one's a professional thief." I kept my eyes fixed on the window, but every word was a punch to the gut. Not from fear. I had faced armed defendants, lying witnesses, corrupt politicians, but from the coldness with which he erased my existence, my history, my dignity. We arrived at the Central Precinct, a gray, impersonal building that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. They made me walk down the main corridor as if I were a trophy. "Look what I caught today," Colby announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. A lady borrowing a luxury Escalade and posing as a federal judge. Some officers laughed. Others pretended not to hear. None looked me in the eye. In the triage room, they treated me like any common prisoner. Fingerprints, front and profile photos, humiliating questions about drugs, criminal records, contacts. When I asked to call my lawyer, Colby replied, "Sure, Auntie. Going to call your little grandson to help you?" My jewelry was removed, including the wedding ring my husband placed on my finger 42 years ago, days before leaving for Vietnam. "This must be worth a pretty penny, huh? A rich husband's gift?" he scoffed, spinning the ring between his fingers before tossing it into an unmarked plastic box. My judge's badge was placed with my belongings, as if it were a mere trinket. Meanwhile, Colby filled out his report with blatant lies. Aggressive behavior, refusal to cooperate, suspicion of using false documents and possession of goods of dubious origin. I observed everything in silence, memorizing every detail, every name, every hour. I knew that moment wouldn't end there. I knew that sooner or later he would have to answer for every word, every gesture, every mocking laugh. I asked for my cell phone back, not to call just any lawyer, but to activate Ebony Protocol, an emergency system created after the assassination of a federal judge in 2012. I simply said, "I need Ebony Protocol activated. I am being detained without legal cause on Oak Ridge. Officer Colby, Plate 318 Delta. Clear violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments." My assistant understood immediately. In less than 5 minutes, I received an encrypted message. "Support en route. Stay strong." Colby, of course, thought I was bluffing. Going to call the Justice League now, Grandma? But what he didn't know, and would only discover weeks later, before a room full of reporters, federal authorities, and national cameras, was that, at that exact moment, the judicial protection system had already been activated. And when that happens, even the mayor answers the phone. 20 minutes passed. 30. I was sitting on a metal chair, still handcuffed, while Colby bragged in the next room. Then, the reception phone rang. The duty sergeant answered, and his face paled. "Yes, sir. Yes, immediately." He hung up, looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost, and whispered to one of the officers, "Call the chief. Now." 5 minutes later, 3 black cars with federal license plates pulled into the precinct parking lot. Men in suits and ties got out, wearing earpieces and firm expressions. One was the federal court's director of security, another, an FBI agent. The third, my chief of staff. They didn't ask. They demanded. Immediate release of Judge Whitmore, surrender of all detention records, copy of all body camera footage, and administrative suspension of the involved officer, effective immediately. Colby, who until then had been smiling arrogantly, froze. "Judge?" "What judge?" he asked, looking at me as if I had transformed before his eyes. The sergeant, sweating profusely, stammered, "Officer, ma'am, you are a federal judge?" I simply nodded. Colby tried to justify himself. "She said she was a judge, but it seemed like a lie. No one believes that." The director looked at him with glacial calm. "A misunderstanding is when you confuse salt with sugar. This is abuse of authority, racial discrimination, and unlawful detention of an active federal official. This is a crime." I was released in less than 10 minutes. My belongings were returned with reverence. Even my wedding ring was handed back with a formal apology. But I didn't leave. I asked to speak with the police chief. He arrived sweating, tie askew, begging for forgiveness. "It was a terrible mistake, Your Honor. We will investigate, punish, reform." I interrupted him calmly. "This isn't about me. It's about all the people who don't have a badge, a lawyer, or a government emergency number to call. It's about those who suffer in silence because they have no voice." That night, I convened an emergency meeting with the Department of Justice, not as a victim, but as a citizen, and I requested that the case be referred to the Federal Civil Rights Court. Colby was suspended immediately. His name leaked. The cameras showed everything. And most importantly, we discovered he had a history of selective stops, almost all against Black people in affluent neighborhoods. The department had filed away the complaints, claiming lack of evidence. Now, they had too much evidence. But Colby still didn't understand the gravity of what he had done. He thought it was just a warning, maybe a fine. He didn't know that, soon, he would be before me, not as an executioner, but as a defendant. And I, not as a victim, but as a judge. But that he didn't know yet. And while he slept peacefully that night, convinced that everything would blow over, I was already preparing the court where his career, and perhaps his freedom, would be judged. The days that followed my detention were a silent whirlwind of strategic moves that Officer Colby couldn't even imagine were happening. While he bragged at the precinct about catching a fake judge trying to act rich, I had already activated protocols that set in motion a federal machine more powerful than any street officer could conceive. I didn't call a common lawyer. I called the heart of the American judiciary. My emergency code activated Ebony Protocol, a mechanism created after the assassination of a federal judge in Mississippi, precisely to protect magistrates against local abuses. In less than an hour, my office had notified the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, and the National Judicial Security Council. No one yelled. No one threatened. They simply acted. And it was precisely this institutional calm that made everything more terrifying for those within the system. Except Colby, of course, who remained convinced he had just done his job. Meanwhile, I was at home, drinking tea with my granddaughter on my lap, as if nothing had happened. But behind the scenes, federal agents were already analyzing body camera footage, cross-referencing data from Colby's previous stops, and identifying an alarming pattern. 17 stops in the last 14 months involving Black drivers in affluent neighborhoods, all without just cause, all filed as inconclusive. The department had ignored formal complaints, discredited witnesses, and protected Colby with the excuse of high productivity in arrests. Except, this time, the arrest was a federal judge in the full exercise of her civil duties. And that changed everything. The following Monday, the police chief called me personally. His voice trembled. "Judge Whitmore, I offer my deepest apologies. It was a very serious mistake. Officer Colby has been preventively suspended. We are opening an internal investigation and—" I interrupted calmly. "I don't want apologies. I want transparency. I want every stop he made in the last 3 years to be reevaluated. I want access to internal complaint records, and I want the Community Oversight Board to be convened immediately." He hesitated. "But that would require the mayor's authorization." "Then call him," I replied. "Because if I have to ask the Department of Justice to intervene, it won't be an internal investigation. It will be a federal audit with a search and seizure warrant for all your files." The silence on the other end of the line was more eloquent than any speech. They knew I wasn't bluffing. Because federal judges don't bluff. They issue orders. Meanwhile, Colby continued living as if nothing had happened. He posted photos with friends over the weekend, laughed in bars, told the story as if it were a victory. "I caught an old woman pretending to be a judge. She even had a fake badge," he said, unaware that every word was being recorded by colleagues who now feared being dragged down with him. One of the officers who was at the scene, Harris, the older one, discreetly contacted my office. He said he tried to warn Colby that he asked to verify my identity, but was ignored. He said that older black women don't drive Escalades, Harris recounted, ashamed. And that, even if it were true, she didn't belong in that neighborhood. These words were included in the preliminary report of the Department of Justice. Every phrase, every gesture, every mocking laugh was being cataloged as evidence of intentional racial discrimination, not a misunderstanding, but a pattern of conduct incompatible with the oath to protect the Constitution. What Colby didn't understand, and perhaps never will, is that in the United States, offending an ordinary citizen might generate a complaint. Offending an active federal authority generates an institutional crisis, and humiliating someone with the power to influence national funding, policies, and reforms, that generates an earthquake. Because I wasn't just a judge. I was a member of the National Judicial Ethics Committee, an advisor to the Department of Justice on issues of equity in the criminal justice system, and, until the previous year, coordinator of an $8 million federal fund earmarked for anti-discrimination training programs for police forces. Yes, Colby's own department had received $220,000 from that fund. And now, every dollar was under scrutiny. But none of this was told to him. No one showed up at his house with threatening papers. No one arrested him in front of his family. Justice, in this case, didn't come with sirens. It came with silence, with encrypted emails, with closed meetings in Washington, with technical reports that would seal his fate without him realizing it. While he slept, his name was already on high operational risk lists in the federal security system. His badge had been deactivated in databases shared with federal agencies. Even his access to the police's online training system had been suspended. For credential update, the automatic message stated. I, for my part, continued my routine. I presided over hearings, reviewed appeals, had lunch with my daughters. But, every night before going to sleep, I read the reports arriving from the Department of Justice. Each new testimony, each recovered recording, each internal email from the precinct showed me how deep the problem was, and how much it went beyond a single arrogant officer. It was a system that allowed, encouraged, and protected this type of behavior. And that's when I decided, punishing Colby wasn't enough. The system that created him needed to be transformed. I began drafting a proposal I would call the Whitmore Protocol, a set of mandatory guidelines for any department receiving federal funds for cooperation with the judiciary. Among them, monthly audits of stops by race and gender, mandatory implicit bias training with federal certification, creation of community councils with real investigative power, and automatic suspension of disbursements in cases of proven civil rights violations. I presented the idea to the Attorney General. He read in silence for 10 minutes. Then he looked at me and said, "This will change everything." But Colby still knew nothing. The following Tuesday, he appeared at the precinct with a union lawyer, confident that everything would be resolved with a warning. It was just an error in judgment, he told the sergeant. The lady overreacted. The sergeant, now under federal investigation for omission, merely shook his head and murmured, "You have no idea what you've done, Ryan." And it was true. Because soon, very soon, he would be called to appear at a hearing in federal court, and when he entered room 304, he would see a woman with gray hair, a sober dress, and a firm gaze sitting on the judge's bench. Only then would he understand that the lying grandma he humiliated on Oak Ridge Avenue was not an imposter. She was the law, but that he didn't know yet. And while he laughed with friends at some bar, I was already preparing the sentence that would not only end his career, but rewrite the rules of the game for thousands of police officers nationwide. Because justice is not revenge. Justice is prevention. And I was determined to ensure that no other woman, young or old, judge or cleaner, had to go through what I did just for daring to exist with dignity where someone thought she shouldn't be. The hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday in November, at the Federal Court for the Northern District of Georgia, Room 304, the same one where, years earlier, I had judged police corruption cases that seemed too distant from reality to hurt. But now, I was there not as an observer, but as the protagonist of a story that had begun with a simple, "Stop here, ma'am," and would end by rewriting the rules of the system. I entered through the side door wearing a sober dress, hair tied back, without fanfare. My staff had already prepared everything: the body camera videos, the precinct's internal records, witness testimonies, even the history of 19 selective stops made by Ryan Colby against black drivers in the last 18 months. Everything was organized with the precision of a criminal case, because, in fact, that's exactly what it would become. When I sat on the judge's bench, I felt the weight of the office not as a privilege, but as a sacred responsibility. My granddaughter was 2 years old. One day, she too would drive a car, and I wanted that, when that happened, no one would judge her by what she drove, but by who she was. Colby entered the room in a crumpled suit and restless eyes, accompanied by a union lawyer who seemed more concerned with saving the department's reputation than defending his client. He didn't recognize me immediately, or perhaps he didn't want to believe. It was only when the federal prosecutor announced, "Your Honor, Judge Eleanor Whitmore will preside over this hearing by designation of the Court of Appeals," that his face fell. He looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost. His lips trembled. "No, it can't be." His lawyer whispered something, but Colby was already elsewhere. Trapped in that moment on Oak Ridge Avenue, when he laughed at my identity, threw my ring on the ground, and called my commendations thrift store costumes, I began the session calmly, but firmly. "Officer Colby, why did you stop me that day?" He stammered. "For suspicious behavior." "What behavior? Was I speeding? Not wearing a seatbelt? With my headlights off?" Silence. "You stopped me because I am a black woman driving an expensive car in a white neighborhood, didn't you?" He didn't answer. Then I displayed the recordings. On the screen, his voice sounded clear as a bell. "I've got an older black lady in an Escalade too new for her. Doesn't fit the street's profile." The entire room heard it. Even his lawyer lowered his head. Next, I showed the internal records. 19 formal complaints against Colby, all filed without investigation. One of the officers who was with him that day testified. I told him to verify her identity. He replied, "Older black women don't drive Escalades. She's lying." It was then that I did something rare. I spoke not as a judge, but as a woman. "Officer Colby, you did not see me as a citizen. You did not see me as a judge. You saw me as a threat simply because I existed where you believed I shouldn't be. This is not policing. This is armed prejudice." He tried to justify himself. "I was just doing my job." "No," I replied. "Your job is to protect the Constitution, and you tore it apart with your own hands." The prosecutor presented the charges: unlawful detention, abuse of authority, violation of civil rights under color of law, a federal crime. The jury, composed of 7 citizens from diverse backgrounds, deliberated in less than an hour. Unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Colby lost his job that same day. His police license was revoked. His retirement benefits canceled. But the most important thing wasn't his punishment. It was what came next. That night, I convened a meeting with the Department of Justice, the mayor, and community leaders. I announced the Whitmore Protocol, monthly audits of stops by race and gender, mandatory implicit bias training with federal certification, a community council with real investigative power, and automatic suspension of federal funds in cases of proven civil rights violation. Colby's department, which received $220,000 annually from a fund I had helped administer, had its disbursements frozen until it could demonstrate real reforms. Today, almost 2 years later, I often return to that corner of Oak Ridge and 12th Street, not out of resentment, but out of hope. Because now, there, is a digital dashboard that shows, in real time, local police traffic stop data. Race, gender, reason, outcome. All public, transparent. Furthermore, the department trains all new recruits based on the Whitmore Protocol. Colby is serving time in a minimum security prison. I heard that, in prison, he started studying law. Maybe one day he will understand what he did. Or maybe not. But the system that protected him for years no longer exists. At least not there. My granddaughter, now 2 years old, loves to sit in the passenger seat of my Cadillac. She points to the mirror and says, "Grandma Judge," and I smile, because I know she will grow up in a slightly more just world, not because everything changed, but because someone refused to accept what was wrong. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to all people who, even when tired, choose to raise their voice. It belongs to the officers who, even under pressure, choose to do what's right. It belongs to the young people who believe they can build something better. And it's yours too, because by listening, sharing, and reflecting, you become part of this change. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, yes, but more than that, carry this message forward. Comment below with your own experiences, your pains, your victories. Tell us about someone who made you believe in justice, or about a moment when you needed to be that person for another. Your words have power, and who knows? Perhaps the next heartwarming story we tell will be yours. Here, we are not just spectators. We are builders of a world where respect is not a privilege, it is the rule, and where no one is judged by the car they drive, but by the character they carry. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling, for being a part of it all.